Hi everyone, and welcome to this video. I hope you have a good time watching what I have to say and that you'll walk away hopefully having learned something new about yourself and the world, other people, and this reality in general. So it is probably going to be a long video, and if it was possible for me to condense everything into a 10-minute video or even a minute-long video, I would do so, but unfortunately this reality is quite complicated and complex and many things to unravel. So yeah, I'm going to do my best to keep it as tight and condensed as possible. And yeah, hope you're in a comfortable position and ready to learn some new things. So let's dive right in. So this video and the preceding videos is part of a larger series that I'm going to be doing, and that series is building a worldview and then providing a tool set to make sense of that worldview and to engage with the world and your daily decisions in a more practical and informed way. Because the way you see yourself, the way you see other people, the way you see reality does affect your decisions. It does affect your actions, how you treat other people, how you treat yourself, how you treat animals, how you treat the planet. So the basic understanding that you have running in the background has a massive effect on basically everything, and that's why I've decided to start with this, because it's going to inform everything going forward and it's going to be systematically built upon from here on out. And also what this is also I'm trying to bridge a gap, and this gap has existed for quite a long time, and it's the gap has widened in recent years, and that gap is between science on the one hand and then meaning on the other. Now, what do I mean by science, and what does that usually entail? So that would look like things like physics and math, use of logic and reason to make sense of the world and sense of this reality. It includes various methods and procedures to, figure out the truth, to systematically investigate something in a way where you can actually make valid claims about, your findings and your experiments. And that also includes, building technology, building things like this computer and any different medical technologies, physical technologies, and all those beautiful things. And then on the other side, we have meaning, right? What does that mean? Meaning usually has to do with myth and narrative, some myths about the human story, the human life, narratives of your personal, life story. The whole idea of the hero's journey, the dark night of the soul, all these different old ideas that try and orient, the human life experience to this physical world that we're in. It also has to do with morality and ethics, right? So what does it mean to, be moral? What is right? What is wrong? How should you treat other people? Ethical standards of, ethical practices in business and in politics and things like that. And it also has to do with what I've mentioned earlier, purpose. Each individual purpose. Like what are you here to do? What is the point of your life? What is the purpose of doing anything? What is the purpose of your work, your relationships, your ideas, your impact, and those types of things. And also has to do with understanding yourself, reality, structures you build inside your mind and on paper to, build systems of knowledge, of truth, of values, of virtues, of ideologies, and those types of things. And then lastly, it also has to do with being, the individual human being, the more existential side of being a human. Now, that includes, things like suffering and pain and loss and love and fear and doubt and hope and, the things that make a human life human. So there's kind of a gap here because these two things don't necessarily work in the same realms, right? But hopefully today I'm going to close that gap and build a bridge where we can utilize both and integrate both into our daily life and to our experience. And before we move on, I just want to make a few comments first before we dive into the meat of the subject. So firstly, we're going to be building a foundation first. So it's the most difficult, but it's also the most important part, because if your foundation is faulty, then the house that you build will eventually collapse. If you have problems or mistakes in the base of your idea set and worldview, then that'll play out in everything else that is coming after that. So that's also why I decided to do this foundation first, because as I just said, it's quite important. So with that, you should expect to not understand everything that I'm going to be talking about at first. If you do, awesome. That'll be great, and I hope that's the case, because I'll try and explain it in clear and consistent terms. But a lot of these concepts and terms and ideas and scientific discoveries, if you'll be hearing about them for the first time, and it might be a lot, it might be confusing, but that's okay. Even if you just understand 10% of what I've said or going to say going forward, that's fine, right? If you watch it again, maybe it'll build out more. But yeah, if you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, that's also a good thing, because it means that I've actually provided value, because I'm teaching you something new or exposing you to something you haven't heard of before. So that's also a good thing. And yeah, I like this quote of, if things were simple, word would have gotten around. Yeah. So that speaks to the fact that life and this reality and the world isn't really that simple. We would like it to be, but unfortunately it's not. So we've got to accept that and work with it. And lastly, the things I'm going to be talking about, I'm drawing from various different fields of inquiry, like philosophy, political science, and old ideas that date back a few thousand years, and then very new high-tech things like quantum physics and all those beautiful things. But the way that I'm going to be combining them, I haven't seen it done yet, and I feel like that's where the value is going to be in this video, is the combining these things, bringing the old into the new, and then explaining it all in the current landscape of where we are in the 21st century with all the chaos in the world that's going on right now. So yeah, and the big heart of the matter can be distilled into this concept of the paradox of duality, right? So this is a paradox that I've come across many times. So I studied philosophy, and that's where we found it first. But even in my own explorations of science and all different kinds of things, consistently, if you go deep enough into any rabbit hole, you find this weird paradox. And it's my hope to unravel this paradox, because it seems to me that this lies at the heart of basically everything that we're going to be dealing with as a human and in science. And if we can understand this paradox and integrate this paradox, I feel like we're going to progress a little bit and learn something new. So for those of you that haven't heard of a paradox or duality, let me explain it first. So let's look at duality first. So duality has a few features, and it usually refers to two things, right? That's where the dual comes from in duality. Now, those two things usually stand in opposition, right? So that's, you have one thing on the one side and another thing on the other side, and they seemingly oppose each other. And another thing about duality is that they seem to be separate things, right? So they seem to be in opposition, but they're also separate, right? And what it also does is it provides contrast. So usually to understand the one thing, you contrast it to the other, and then you can start to make sense of it. And Here are a few examples. So that would be up versus down. You've got positive on the one side and negative on the other. You've got black and you've got white. You've got male, you've got female. You've got the self, you've got others. And then more examples would be you've got hot on the one side, cold on the other. You either love someone or you hate someone, right? Two different things usually in opposition. You've got absolute and relative. You've got the inside, you've got outside, you have on, you have off. All right, so that's duality. Now moving on. The second part is a paradox. Now, so what is a paradox and what features does a paradox usually have? Now, the first feature of a paradox is usually self-contradictory. So in the paradox, it has a sentence or statement, and it seems to be, it's literally contradicting itself. It's said in such a way that it doesn't make sense. It's circular and it just contradicts itself from the get-go. And it's mutually exclusive. So being the one thing excludes it from being another. You can't have both, right? So if you have something being on, then that necessarily implies it can't be off. It excludes the possibility of being off at that stage. It also is a logical impossibility, right? So logically, a paradox doesn't make sense. It falls in on itself. And it seems that logic, doesn't work to solve the paradox. Logic is actually the problem with the paradox because it doesn't make any logical sense. And like I've also mentioned, it leads to circular reasoning. You keep going in a loop, feedback loop, and yeah, you get stuck in that loop. So that's the paradox. And then a few examples of paradox would be, there is no truth. Now, if you look at that statement, so that statement seems to be making a truth claim, right? So if you say there is no truth, then you're claiming that on its own seems to be a truth claim. But in the sentence is there is no truth, right? So you're making a truth claim that there is no truth, and that doesn't make any sense, right? Another one would be being on and off at the same time. Now again, being on excludes it from being off, and being off excludes it from being on. Now, how can something be on and off at the same time? Doesn't make sense. Circular reasoning. All right. And lastly is the phrase, everything is, everything it is not. Right? So how can something be something it's not? Right? So you can only define something by having things that it isn't, right? So you're a human, that means you're not a plant, right? But how can it make sense when you say everything is, it is not, right? So again, there's this weird paradox where these sentences don't seem to make any sense and they feed back into themselves. Now, where does this paradox come from? Where is this type of thing? So one method of trying to make sense of reality and the universe is to take a step back and then to zoom out, right? So we're starting with a blank page. We're saying, okay, scrap everything. Let's investigate how this thing works. Now you can either start to zoom out or you can zoom in. So let's zoom out. Okay, so we zoom out as far back as we can, and now we have the universe as a whole, the whole wide universe. And if you start to zoom in a little bit, then you get things like stars and galaxies and those types of things. And you zoom in a little bit more, you have planets. And then if you're on the planet, you zoom in a little bit more, you have organisms. You have life on that planet. You have animals and weird bacterias and algae and plants and things like that. And then you zoom in a little bit more. Inside those organisms, you have biological cells. Okay, cool, but technology allows us to zoom in even further. Within those cells, the cells are made up of molecules. And then you can go even further. That molecules are made of atoms. Right? So now we're at the atomic level. We've zoomed in very far. Now we're at atoms. And current technology allows us to go even further, and now we're at subatomic particles, right? So we've started at zooming out massively. We're at the universe. We start zooming in, stars, planets, organisms, cells, molecules, atoms. Now we're at subatomic particles. And this, at this stage, is the furthest that we can go. This is the edge of how far we can zoom in. So let's start to investigate that. What do we find at the subatomic particle level? Now, for those of you that haven't heard of some subatomic particles, that's okay. I didn't study biology or chemistry or physics, so I had to spend many hours studying up on this stuff to help explain this and to understand it for myself. But subatomic particles are things like photons, electrons, and quarks, and those type of stuff. And it's okay if you don't know what that is. It doesn't really matter that much. Now, the study of subatomic particles is where we find quantum physics. So you've probably heard of quantum mechanics, quantum physics, quantum theory, quantum computing. And at this stage, this is the furthest we can zoom in, but quantum physics has some weird conclusions and things that they find that seem to contradict our everyday life experience. But at the heart of these mysteries that we find in quantum physics is something that I feel is extremely important and useful for everyday life, and that is what I wish to impart upon you today. So again, I'm not a quantum physicist, so it doesn't matter if you don't know quantum physics or the math behind it. The conclusions are what is important, and I'm not going to explain that now. So one thing that they did in quantum physics is to study light. Now, so how does light work? And light is made out of photons. So they've been doing these experiments where they try and understand the behavior of light. So the thing that they found is that sometimes light behaves like particles and sometimes they behave like waves, right? So in and of itself, that's quite interesting. But what is the problem with that? So that leads to the wave-particle duality, where this sentence explains it, that a given kind of quantum object will sometimes exhibit wave and sometimes particle character in respectively different physical settings. And this also applies to compound particles, where it's groups of particles like atoms and molecules. So yeah, so sometimes the particle in the quantum object exhibits wave behavior and sometimes particle. Okay. Now, why is this an issue? Why is this important? Why are we even speaking about particles and waves? It's because there is a paradox at the base level of creation, because logically, being a particle excludes it from being a wave, and being a wave excludes it from being a particle, right? So again, we're at this weird duality where it acts like two things, but it acts paradoxically, where it's not supposed to make sense, because the behavior of a particle and the characteristics of a particle logically excludes it from being a wave, and also the other way around, right? So this leads to this quote from our famous man, Mr. Albert Einstein, where he says that it seems as though we must sometimes use the one theory and then sometimes the other, while at times we may use either. Now, this creates a new kind of difficulty. We have two contradictory pictures of reality, which separately neither fully explains the phenomenon of light, but together they do, right? So, yeah, this is not an easy issue, but, let's go. Now, this leads to the first problem. So we've zoomed in, we've used quantum physics, and we found this weird problem. And that problem is that the building blocks of the universe have a paradoxical dual nature. Now, to complicate things even further, let's carry on. So let's look at the behavior of an electron. So there on the left, we have a picture of what an electron would look like. So we've looked at how light behaves, what it is. So is it a wave or is it a particle? But we can also ask different questions like how does it behave, like what characteristics, what properties does it have, like what is its probable positions, and what is its momentum at a certain point in time. Now, what they found is quite interesting and relevant, and that is that you can't measure both at the same time. You have to measure one at the expense of the other. So if you want to determine its position, you can't at that same time determine the momentum. If you want to determine the momentum, you can't determine its position, right? So you have to choose. You have to do one and then you have to do the other. You can't do both at the same time. So they calculate each separately using the waveform function. But then what happens is that the two answers that they get are mathematically incompatible with each other. But yet it still works to get the position and the momentum. So this is weird. So you can't measure both at the same time. So then you measure one and then you measure the other one. And then together those answers mathematically don't work if you put them next to each other, but they still work to give you the accurate predictions of its position and momentum. So that is weird and a lot, but sometimes visual aids help us to make sense of these difficult concepts. And this is why I've put this picture. So if you start to look at the one specific point, and you can see the other one start to turn black or darker. But if you try and look at the darker one on the other side, then it starts to turn white. So it's kind of like this weird thing where if you look at the one thing, then you can see on the side, okay, that's what it is. But then when you go there, it's changed. And then it's over there again. So it's this weird shifting around type of phenomenon. Now, this leads to the second problem, and that is we can't view all aspects of a system at once. So if we're trying to understand something and trying to make sense of something, of a system or, a particular thing in reality, all the different aspects thereof, you can't see the whole picture and study the whole thing at once. But then, isolating the aspects creates contradictions, right? So you can't view the whole thing at once. So it's like, okay, fine, then I'll do it piece by piece. But if you do it piece by piece, that creates logical contradictions. But you still need to understand all aspects to give a full description of the totality of the phenomenon. So again, we're sitting with the problem of you can't view everything. You need to isolate, but isolation creates contradictions, but you still need to understand all aspects to give a clear description. So now we're stuck in a weird situation again. So how do we deal with this? How do we make sense of these problems, these weird paradoxes that we found at the heart of creation? And this is where I'm going to try and give you some tools and keys to unlock these mysteries, so to speak. And let's move on. So there's the first key that will help us to deal with these types of weird paradoxical phenomenon is the concept of complementarity, right? So that's a large word, but it just has to do with complementary things, to instead of seeing things as opposing, see them as complementary to each other. So complementarity. So complementarity is an approach where something is analyzed in multiple ways, right? So when you're studying something, you view it from many different angles, And you also realize that you have to give different descriptions in order to answer different types of questions, right? So that means that the description that you give to the system will automatically, determine the type of questions that you can ask about that system. So what that leads to is that you should expect mutually incompatible answers, but both are correct and they provide different kinds of insight. Now, I didn't come up with this concept. I've learned it from quantum physicists themselves that spoke in podcasts and people that have spent their whole career dealing with these types of issues. And for them, this concept of complementarity is a fundamental fact of reality and is very useful to make sense of what is going on. So that's the first key, complementarity. Now the second key is what I call relationality. It has to do with the relation between different parts of something. Now, relationality also has two parts to it. It has to do with the relation within something, how something relates with itself, how the two parts of something relate within something, and how that something relates to other things, things not in that system. So in the system, there's a internal relation, and from that system, there's relations between all other types of things. So moving on, if we look at the relation within part, we find that the pair of opposites are actually the two sides of the same thing. So instead of thinking of the pair of opposites of, opposing things, we should see them as complementary things, that they're actually the flip side of the coin, that it's up and down. It's two sides of the same thing. It's not opposing things. It's they work together to create it in the first place. So you cannot have one without the other. They go together. So they create each other at the same time, and you need to have both sides for either to exist, right? And the last thing about the relation within is that it co-constitutes itself in a self-reflexive way. So co-constitute means that both sides create each other simultaneously. So it's not that one existed and then created the other, it's that they both come into existence at the same time. They co-create each other. And the self-reflexive part means it relates back into itself in a feedback loop. But I will explain that a bit more in depth as we move on. So let's take the first part. The pairs of opposites are two sides of the same thing. Now, again, I'm going to use a visual aid to help explain this. And the best thing I've found so far to help explain this is this old photo, a picture that you've probably come across before. And that is the yin-yang symbol. So a few examples would be you have black on the one side and you have white on the other, right? But what this image illustrates is that you can't actually see black without white, right? They go together. It provides the contrast to the other. Like even on the screen now, the black text is on a white background. If it was both white, can't see anything. So you need both, and that's why in the image it creates this harmonious type of circular thing where within the black you find the white and within the white you find the black, because fundamentally you can't have one without the other. They go together. And there are more examples of this, like up and down. So those are relative terms. So if you're going up, that means there's something downwards of it, right? So down And down, if you're moving down, that means there's something above it, and it's the opposite of going up. And you've also got north and south. So even if you look at the planet, if you go far enough north, right, you start to go south. If you go from where you are right now, you go to the North Pole and you keep going, you move so much north, you go around the circle, and then all of a sudden you're going south. Quite interesting, right? Then also you have things like male and female. Right? There wouldn't be any males if there were no females. There wouldn't be any females if there were no males. Right? They're both part of being human, or being an organism that has the capacity to procreate. So they go together. They're two sides of the same thing. So a male and a female are two sides of the same thing, and that thing is being a human. They're not opposing, they're complementary. And also you have things like order and chaos. Now, something is defined as being ordered by being not in chaos. And you have different degrees between the two. And what this symbol also shows is that there's a harmonious balance that you can find between the two. Because if something is too ordered, right, there's no capacity for it to change. There's no capacity for it to adapt to the environment. But if something is too chaotic, there's no structure, there's no identity, there's no thing that actually gets created. So that's where the middle line, what they sometimes refer to as the Tao, comes in, where it's the balance between those order and chaos, where if you look at nature, for example, chaos is a big part of what makes nature function, right? So the lava that spews out of the volcano and destroys everything in its path, if you go forward a few 100,000 or million years, that really makes the soil rich, and that leads to new growth, right? It removes stagnation. If you ever made a garden, you find that if you need to aerate the soil, you need to add some chaos into the system for new growth to occur. But if you add too much chaos, then it just dies. So yeah. And then also you have things like hot and cold, so usually we tend to understand hot as opposing to cold, but if you look at a thermometer, where does hot begin and cold end? It's only temperature. Hot and cold are relative terms to each other. It's two sides of the same thing, and that thing is temperature. And then also more abstract things like love and hate. So you really love someone or something, or like someone or something, or you really dislike something or someone, or you hate them, or there's the middle ground where it's neutral. There's no like or dislike, it's just flat. And then concept like life and death. So if you think about it, there would be no life if there was no death, right? So you define something as being alive by understanding what it means to be not alive, to be dead. What is different between a rock and a plant? The one is alive and the one is not. So it's two parts of the same interplaying type of thing. And then also, importantly, is we have self and the other. So you have yourself, and then you also have the other, which is the not self, what is not you. So you understand yourself as, what do you include in your own self-identity, and then you create a barrier, and everything not that is the other. But if you also think about it, you define yourself in terms of the other, but also there wouldn't be a self if there were no others. Other people are necessary for you to be created in the first place. You need to have had parents, and they need to have had, other people to interact with in a society, and all those different types of things. So again, these two pairs of opposites are two sides of the same thing that go together and they form this unified whole. Now, if we move on and look at this picture for a little bit. So on the one side we have black, and then the other side we have white, and then all these beautiful shades of gray between them. Now, what conclusions can we draw from this? So firstly, that there's an infinite amount of degrees between the two poles of something, and it shades very gradually, right? So obviously on the screen we have a certain amount of pixels and the resolution isn't that high, but if you zoom in, you can zoom in very, very far, and the shading becomes very, very gradual, so gradual that it also almost becomes imperceptible. Now, the exact moment of the switch from black to white or white to gray or whatever, it can't actually be determined in a non-arbitrary way, because if you zoom in far enough, the divisions become so gradual that eventually you need to make a human decision of, okay, fine, now this is gray, or now this is off-white, or whatever, but it's kind of arbitrary. And lastly, if we're looking at the extremes, so obviously on the left side, you can see that's black. You know, there's no doubt about it, it's obvious. On the right side, you have, that's obviously white. But in between the things, it's not always that obvious, and that means we are required to work with nuance. Things aren't always so black and white. It's all the time various different shades of gray. So that also applies to, you know, everyday life and morality and stuff like that, where unfortunately people are quite morally gray a lot of the times, and things aren't so easily put into black and white. Although we'd like to, it's not quite that simple. Now, if we add to that, the previous picture was black and white. Now this is just all the different colors that we can see, the visible light spectrum. There's obviously a lot of different things that we can't even see, but this is just here to illustrate that this adds more complexity. You don't have just black and white, you have yellow, green, pink, purple, gray, orange, all these different colors and all these different things that adds to the complexity of life. It's not just black and white. We have many different things that are going on, each with their own gradients and shades, and yeah, so that's just something to take into account. And now that the part of co-constitutes itself self-reflexively. Now, the image that here is quite an old mythical image, but I feel it's useful to illustrate this idea, where something is eating itself, it creates itself, and it sustains itself. Now, one example would be nature, right? So nature literally feeds on itself. You know, there's this sustainable loop where the ecosystem of the planet is constantly creating itself and it's feeding on itself, right? So, but also another important example is that of an individual and society. So the individual exists within a society, right? But a society consists of a bunch of individuals, and the individual gets affected by society, you know, the societal norms and rules, things from your parents, the media, schools, whatever, that affects how you are brought up, it affects how you see the world, it affects how you act. But also, the individual affects society. You know, if each individual changes their behavior, that'll feed back into society. So they co-create each other and they feed back into each other, where the individual affects society and society affects the individual, and vice versa. So that's where this idea of self-reflexivity comes from, where the two sides refer back to itself and they change as a result of that. So this leads into the this quote from a 13th century poet reading, "Yesterday I was clever, so I wanted to change the world. But today I'm wise, so I'm changing myself." Right? So if we think about what we just spoke about of the self-reflecting nature of the relationship between the individual and society, if each individual focuses on their inner world and changing themselves, then obviously that'll change society. If overnight we can press a button and every individual changes, that means society has changed, right? It's very difficult to change society as a whole. But if each person changes themselves, then the world will change, society will change. So that's what this means. And in the spirit of, going back in time, so this was written by a 13th century poet, is this principle of polarity that comes from this book called the Kybalion. And this book was written in the early 1900s. And apparently the ideas and theories and knowledge comes from thousands of years ago, from like ancient Egypt and before. So I find it quite interesting to combine the old knowledge with the new things like, quantum mechanics, which is quite recent and cutting edge. But anyway, in this book, they have this principle of polarity, which goes that everything is dual, everything has poles, everything has its pair of opposites, that like and unlike are the same, that opposites are identical in nature, but different in degree, that extremes meet, all truths are but half-truths, and that all paradoxes may be reconciled. So you can see why I included this, especially because of that all paradoxes may be reconciled, because we're dealing with duality, we're dealing with paradox, and this feeds into the key to start to make sense of this, start to make this into something that we can understand and integrate. Now, if we move back to the concept of relationality, so that's what we've been working with, just to remind you. We've been working with the internal relation, the relation within. But the second part was relations between. And that's what we're going to be looking at now. So again, I'm going to use a visual aid to help explain this relations between. So what you see here is this great big interconnected web of things where each lit up node represents a system. And then between these systems, you have all these various connections, some more explicit than others, some more direct, and others faint, and so far that they're hardly perceivable. You can't even see them, but they're still there. So the relations between is this massive interconnected web between all these different types of systems and things that we're studying. Now, each of these nodes or systems is has its own type of behavior, and that's where this idea of complex adaptive systems come from. Now, this is something that I learned in philosophy, and it's quite interesting and important to understand because it's relevant to basically all the type of systems that are important in human life, which I'll get to soon. So let's take a step back and see that we have a system. And in this case, we would refer to that as an open system. So we have something that we're investigating, and what is around the system is what we would call the environment. And so you have the system, everything that's included within that system, and everything that's not included in the system gets put into the environment. It forms part of what is not the system. So that's the environment. And usually that is defined by its boundary. So the boundary is what separates the environment from the system. It's what helps create, a type of stable structure where something can have an identity and be understood and be created in the first place. Now, I use dotted lines to create this boundary for a reason, which you will see now, because we tend to put rigid boundaries around things, but unfortunately, it's not so simple. So the way an open system works is that you have inputs from the environment. So the environment sends information into the system, and then that system reacts to that input, and then that produces outputs, right? But those outputs feed back into the environment, and then that environment creates the inputs, and those inputs go back into the system, and that system creates outputs, and then again we have this loop where the thing gets created by the environment, but also creates the environment, if you understand what I'm trying to say. That's where the adaptive part of the system comes from. So it reacts to its environment, and it also affects its environment. Now, let's list some features that a complex system or a complex adaptive system has. So firstly, the system and the environment form a unified whole. So there isn't just a unified whole within the system, where a system is defined as a set of entities that have, through their interactions and relations, create the system. There's also a unity between the system and the environment, right? We shouldn't separate them completely and just focus on just the system to try and understand it. You need to also understand the environment and how that affects the whole thing. So that becomes a unity. And then secondly, there's a balance between being open to the environment and also closed to the environment. Because if something is completely open, then that'll create chaos, right? If too much information gets entered into the system, it'll get overloaded and it'll get destroyed. But if it's completely closed, then it won't be able to adapt, it won't be able to react, and it won't be able to read the inputs and receive the inputs from the environment. So there's this balance between openness and closedness, okay? And also there's a non-one-to-one relationship between cause and effect. So what that means is that a small input can have actually a large effect on output, or a large input can have a small output, or a small input can have no output, or a small input can have a small output, or a large input can have no output. So unfortunately, it's not so easy to determine how the system would react to the new inputs, because there isn't always this one-to-one linear relationship between cause and effect, between input and output, which complicates things even further. And another feature of complex adaptive systems is that there's an abrupt shift that can happen after a critical threshold is reached, right? So the system is existing, it's reacting to its environment, it's adapting, but it has a mostly stable state. But what can happen is there can come a point where so much around it has changed and so much pressure is put upon the thing where literally there's an abrupt change in the whole thing. There's like almost catastrophic change, where after a certain point has passed, there's no going back, and what comes after you can't really predict, because that's quite relevant for what's going on in the world today, as I'll get to now. And then also, to add a little bit more complexity, is that each component within the system can also be complex systems themselves, right? So in the system, you usually have different entities like cells or people and things like that. But each of those components can also be complex systems themselves. They are nested, and that, makes it even more difficult to, completely model these things, right? Because even using this language, even creating these pictures and this PowerPoint, we're trying to simplify, we're trying to condense, but unfortunately, complexity doesn't allow itself to be completely condensed and simplified. So I've been talking about definitions so far, but what are examples of complex adaptive systems or open systems? And they're quite popular and known things. So that will include, ant colonies, the biosphere on the planet, different ecosystems that we have, the smaller ecosystems, and then the larger ecosystem on the planet. The human brain is an adaptive system. Our immune system is an adaptive system, and even cells, are complex adaptive systems. So that's why I've been, taking the time to explain this, because, it's everywhere. The most important things seems to be complex adaptive systems. And also, any social group endeavors, any time where humans come together as a group to create things, that behaves and exhibits the characteristics of complex adaptive systems. And that includes our political systems, our financial systems, our economic systems, communities, organizations, cultural groups, religious groups, all act like complex adaptive systems. And this is why I've been, explaining this, because in the future, I want to be speaking about political systems, about our financial systems, about, our ethical systems. And it doesn't really help to, work with, the specifics of these systems if we don't even understand that how this thing functions in the first place, that it has this characteristic of being an adaptive complex system. So yeah, I hope that makes sense. And then if we move on, so this leads to the third key. So I've been throwing the word around complexity or complex system a lot. And I'll be making a video in the future where we dive deeper into complexity. But for now, this will suffice. And the third key is complex thinking. Now, what does complex thinking mean? What does this look like? So complex thinking is where we are going from thinking in terms of either or to both and more, right? So we're used to thinking in binary terms. I mean, even our coding language is in binary. It's in ones and zeros. But in quantum computing, it's 1, 0, or both. And that's what makes it so difficult, because our mind, even though it's probably functioning at that type of level, the way we think is a bit more simplified. We need to think in terms of either or. It's either this thing or it's that thing. It's either on or it's off, right? But complex thinking is more that it's both and more, right? So it's not just both where we equate one to each other. It's the same, because that doesn't really say much. So it's both of those things and more, because the interaction of both of those things creates a different level of, complexity and a different type of phenomena. And the second part of complex thinking is that we should be able to hold and move between multiple perspectives, right? So earlier when we were talking about complementarity, it was the idea of, analyzing something in multiple ways to give different descriptions to answer different questions. So this builds into that, where you need multiple perspectives to understand something, but you should be able to hold them, even if sometimes they seem to contradict each other. You need to have them and then be able to move between these multiple perspectives to get a fuller understanding of, whatever it is you're trying to understand, because by definition, a perspective is limited. If you're looking something from the front, that means you can't see it from the back. If you're looking something from the back, you can't see the front, right? So, but if you only understand what it looks like from the front, that's only half the picture, right? If you only understand what something looks like from the back, that's also just half the picture. But there's not just front and back, there's the sides, there's all these different gradients and angles and things like that, so it gets a lot. And also the last part is that we should acknowledge our limitations. We should acknowledge where, you know, we reach our limit as a human, as, you know, because we're embedded in this reality. We don't have an infinite mind to be able to understand everything and to see everything. So we should acknowledge our limitations without projecting them onto reality. So just because we can't completely see complexity or understand it, it doesn't mean it's not there, right? Just because we can't see infrared doesn't mean it's not there. Just because we can't see an X-ray doesn't mean it's not there. So we shouldn't project our limitations upon reality. We shouldn't, you know, because sometimes, you know, the truths about reality are quite startling and uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean we should, you know, ignore them or repress them. And yeah, so I'm going to give an example of these limitations that we have. So here's a picture on the left of a square, right? But this is in 2 dimensions. So a dimension is, one dimension would be length and the other would be width. So that's why it has 2 dimensions. And then in 3 dimensions, we add height. So now we have got a cube. And we exist and see and perceive in 3-dimensional space. So that's where we are comfortable with, that's where our brain works, that's where our visual perception operates. You know, but what about 4 dimensions, you know, and 5 dimensions and 6 and 7? Do they exist? What do they look like? Can we even imagine them? Can we even wrap our mind around them? So the picture on the right is what they call the tesseract. Now, that is the 3-dimensional shadow of what a 4-dimensional cube would look like, right? So we can't even see 4 dimensions. We literally can't, our brains literally aren't wired to be able to see in 4 dimensions, right? So the best we can do is try and see what the shadow in 3 dimensions would look like of a 4-dimensional object. And that's what that picture on the right represents. So that's not even the full picture. That's just the shadow of something, you know. So we can reach our limits, right? And then we can sometimes make inferences from just beyond that edge back. But then it's like the shadows, the reverberations, the edge type of cases. So yeah, that's to illustrate just one of the limitations of, you know, where we as humans and with our tools and technologies and things, we reach the barrier where we really can't go any further yet. But that doesn't mean we should stop there. We can, you know, try and learn more, but we should also acknowledge our limitation at the same time. So if we go back to complex thinking, I want to do a few examples to help illustrate how this works, and hopefully you'll be able to understand them by now if you take into account the things that I've been talking about. So firstly, we should understand something like an open system as being both autonomous from as well as dependent upon the environment. Okay, so for something to have structure and to have a definable identity, where you can pick it out, you can say, okay, that is that thing now. It has to have its own separate and autonomous identity from the environment, okay? But that thing wouldn't have existed in the first place without the environment being there, right? So that's where we should try and understand something not as completely autonomous or completely dependent. It's both autonomous and dependent on the environment at the same time. So if we go back to the first, when we were talking about paradoxes, where we said something being both on and off at the same time, at that point it didn't make much sense. But now if we think of a complex system as being both autonomous from, as well as dependent upon, the environment at the same time, that seems to be making more sense, right? So yeah, that's one thing. And then the other thing is, or another example is that nothing matters and everything matters. Okay, so like we just said about multiple perspective, for something to be understood, it needs to be put into perspective. So yes, if we zoom out and we look at the infinite amount of galaxies and planets and solar systems and just the sheer scale of the universe, then yes, life on Earth doesn't matter. In the grand scheme of things, if you look at the billions of years that pass and the fact that our sun in the solar system is going to die out someday, then it's easy to understand where the notion comes from that nothing really matters in the end, okay? But that's when you zoom out. That's when the perspective is like completely large. But if you zoom back in and you take a different perspective, a more human perspective, everything that you do does matter, right? If everything is connected in this large web where, the feedback goes through the whole system, then, the way you treat the cashier in the shop matters. The kind gesture that you give to the person on the street, it does matter. The way you treat animals around you, and if you help them and love them and, protect them, that does matter, So yes, it's true that in the grand scheme of things, nothing matters. But if you zoom back in and take a human perspective, everything matters, Everything can be meaningful. Your life matters, your decisions matter, your actions and how you treat other people really does matter. And complex thinking allows us to think of both, both are true. Nothing matters if you zoom out, and everything matters when you zoom in. Anyway, so that's another example. And the last example, a fun one, is the question, is Romeo, the character in Romeo and Juliet, Shakespeare, the author, right? So Romeo is a character that was created by Shakespeare. So you can argue that there would be no Romeo without Shakespeare, and it's a mental creation within Shakespeare, and Shakespeare's thoughts and his creativity creates Romeo. So in a sense, Romeo is Shakespeare, right? But they're not equal to each other, because Romeo is just a character in a book and Shakespeare was a real person. So they aren't equal to each other. In another sense, no, Romeo is not Shakespeare. And also, I've just said that Romeo comes from, Shakespeare's creativity and his mind, but Shakespeare also had different influences that, impacted his writing. He took inspiration from many different authors older than him and that came before. So even Shakespeare was affected by things that weren't him. So that leads to Romeo not really completely being Shakespeare's creation, because Shakespeare was influenced by other people. And another way we can look at it is that Romeo, the character, has like taken a life of its own. A lot of times these fictional characters, due to the popularity of them and all the books written about them and theories about them, it kind of takes on a life of its own. Right, so there's many different descriptions and ways in which this question can be answered, each of them correct in their own way, and they provide different sorts of insight. So yeah, complex thinking links back to that concept of complementarity that we spoke about in the beginning. So let's just take a breath. I know we've been going on for like an hour, And that was a lot, but let's just recap how we got here and where we are right now. So we're speaking about this pattern, and that pattern is the paradox of duality. Now, I've said that I've seen this pattern everywhere, and it's difficult for me to understand it, and I spent countless hours researching it and condensing it, and now I'm explaining it. So there's this pattern of duality that we found, and then we illustrated that it exists in the first place, and we illustrated how it works through quantum physics, right? We illustrated that this paradox exists and that it can be found when you investigate the world using quantum physics. And then we found two problems. First problem is that base reality has a paradoxical dual nature. And the second problem was that all aspects of a system can't be viewed simultaneously. You can't view them all at the same time. You need to isolate, but then isolation leads to contradictions, but you still need to understand all aspects, right? So we started with the pattern, we illustrated how we found it and how it works, and then what problems that creates. And then I've provided tools. Those three tools were the concept of complementarity, relationality, and then complex thinking. So this is where we are right now. Moving on. If we go back to this picture, right? So I've been using these visual aids to help illustrate these ideas. But what is this? What is this picture that I've been using? So on the left side, we have an experiment showing the neurons in the brain of a rat. Okay, and that looks quite similar to the picture on the right. Now, the picture on the right is a picture of the universe, okay? That big lit up cluster in the middle is a bunch of galaxies, you know, which is, on the left side, we've zoomed in far. On the right side, we've zoomed out very far. You see the same type of pattern, and the webs on the right side is dark matter, connecting all these stars and galaxies and solar systems, and, you know, so, you know, that's quite interesting. And we're seeing this pattern, you know, a similar pattern when we zoom in very far and then zooming out very far. Now, this picture I took myself walking in the vineyards here close to my home. Now, this is a snail, or a shell of a snail on a grapevine. So this is meant to illustrate life, you know, so this is where something is growing and is in nature, but there's this interesting spiral pattern. As you can see, there's a spiraling type of shape that's formed with this shell. Now, if you zoom out, this is a hurricane or tornado. Yeah, I think it's a hurricane. Same pattern. Also this spiral type of shape. Okay, quite interesting. Zoom out even further. Okay, now we have a galaxy with stars and planets and thousands of light years apart. Same pattern. You can see this type of spiral thing. Now, you don't have to take my word for it that there's this spiral. Here's a screenshot from NASA's Instagram where they drew this spiral pattern in to illustrate. Now, this leads to the third principle, or the second principle from that book called The Kabbalion, which, remember, this is a book that came out in the early 1900s based on ideas that are thousands of years old. Now, the principle of correspondence states that as above, so below, as below, so above, and that the macrocosm and the microcosm are reflections of each other, okay? And that the universe is self-similar across all scales and different planes. So it's stacked upon each other and they reflect the same patterns up and down, okay? And this is because everything that exists in the universe comes from the same source, and the same principles and rules and laws and characteristics govern everything, okay? So it's not that we have different sets of, every aspect of the universe exists in the same reality. Okay, it's governed by the same rules, same principles. And that's where this idea of the principle of correspondence comes from. Now, the question then becomes, does this principle apply to even more abstract type of things? So far, we've talked about mostly concrete and physical type of things. But what if we go even more abstract and look at systems of language and knowledge? How we communicate with each other, how words have meaning, how we build systems of language and knowledge, which is a bit more on the abstract level. Now, without going into too much detail, we did complexity theory in philosophy, and it was very complicated and difficult, and we only did it in our third year and then an honors level, but I'm not going to go into too much detail of how they reached these conclusions, but the conclusions and the pattern that they found is the same type of pattern that we've spoke about in quantum physics, where in this case, words have meaning due to contrast by being not something else. Okay, something is defined as being not that other thing. Okay, you need to be able to separate it. And also they found the same pattern of relationality within concepts, right? This internal relation as well as the relation between things. And language systems aren't static, right? New words crop up every day. People have actually different definitions in their mind of the same words. This thing is adapting. New words come up, and so if we look at systems of language and of knowledge, it's the same pattern. We have contrast and we have relationality. And also, language systems behave the same way as complex adaptive systems that we've been speaking of before. Now, if we go back to this sentence that we spoke about earlier, this everything is everything it is not, now this would hopefully start to make sense, because for words to have meaning or a concept to have meaning, it's defined by being not that other thing, okay? But that other thing also can affect back the meaning of this thing, okay? So there's this massive interconnected web, and imagine it looks like, neurons of a brain, but this is the language system now, where it's all connected to each other. They have their individual identity, but the connections to other words and concepts are always there, some more explicit than others, some more influential than others, but the connections are there. And if we apply the same concept of relationality to language systems, systems of meaning and of ethics and morality, we can also do the same exercise of relation within and then relations between. So if we do the relation within, we find that there can be a balance, right? Where the self and the other is balanced, where you recognize the importance of other people, and you recognize the similarities between you and other people, where you recognize that we're all part of being human. We all have the same fears and doubts and pains and general life experience. And there can be an internal balance. And again, things like male and female, or masculine and feminine. You can't have one without the other. They go together. They should be, equal, balanced. And again, growth and decay. So in nature and in life, growth is just as important as decay. So nothing grows infinitely, right? Especially if you look in nature, part of holistic sustainability is this cycle of growth, and then stagnation, and then decay, and then death, and then rebirth, and growth, decay, rebirth. it's all part of this greater process. And also giving and receiving. If you can't give something if there's no one to receive it. A gift is meant to be received. And yeah. But in typical human fashion, we have unbalanced these scales. We have privileged one at the expense of the other. One is more important, according to us, than the other. So in current day society, and also throughout history, the self is more important than the other. Okay, we place more importance upon yourself, and we alienate the other. We try and separate ourselves. So what this leads to is selfishness, greed, exploitation, abuse, racism, homophobia, xenophobia, genocide, all those terrible things, because the more you define the other as alien to you, as foreign to you, as different to you, as you dehumanize them, it becomes easier to justify, the bad behavior and the terrible things you do to them. And male historically has been privileged above the female, so it's getting better in society. There are obviously, there's a lot of push to equalize them, to treat them as equals. But even 100 years ago, women weren't allowed to vote, okay, and treated as second-class citizens. They weren't paid the same. If we go back 1,000 years, if you were a king, you were trying to create male heirs. Only males were allowed to rule, and a lot of the times they would kill the female children because it's not a male. Okay, so that's bad. And also growth is privileged above decay. If you look at capitalist society, it's all about growth, all about expansion, more, and screw the environment, screw the workers, screw the negative consequences. We're just focusing on growth. And now we can see, literally as I'm recording this in middle October, there's a massive financial chaos in the world and war looming, and a lot of that has to do with the obsession with growth. Okay, now growth is important, like I've already said, but the consolidation and the decay part is just as important. And if we have just focused a little bit less on growth, then the bust cycles and the crash cycles and the destruction cycles wouldn't be as severe or as they are now. And then also we privilege giving over receiving. Okay, people are conditioned to give their whole life, and you should just work harder and do more, and but also it's important to be able to receive love, to receive patience, to receive compassion. It's important to give to yourself what you give to others. So we have that this thing becomes unbalanced in human life. So relation within. So we've just said that the internal relation can become unbalanced, and that we bias one at the expense of the other, okay? And that this leads to harmful consequences, as I just explained. And the second part then of relationality would be the relations between things, okay? But now we're looking at a bit more abstract type of concepts. So to illustrate, let's take the kindness continuum, right? So the continuum of having someone be very kind on the one side and then very unkind on the other side. So a rude person on the one side and then a loving, kind person on the other. Okay, cool. But that's in isolation. But life doesn't work that way. There's a lot of different things to take in account. So let's say we have a very kind person. But that person, add to that, has weak boundaries. So on the boundaries continuum, they have weak boundaries. They don't know how to say no. They don't know how to stand up for themselves. They don't know how to make sure they're not taken advantage of. right? That your kindness can be taken advantage of. And then what does that lead to? It leads to someone being a pushover. Okay, and that's also not good. And that also leads to other, psychological consequences for that person. And so that's the kindness continuum. But let's take a different one, like the confidence continuum. On the one side, you have, you're very confident, and on the other side, it's unconfident, you're fearful or insecure. Okay. Now, let's work with the very confident side for a moment. If you're a very confident person and you take away humility, or there's no humility, what does that lead to? Arrogance, right? But if you stay on the very confident side, and then there's no good reason to be. So let's say I'm very confident that the Earth is a triangle, okay? There's no good reason for me to believe that the Earth is a triangle. None of the evidence suggests that. Nothing, suggests that. So what does that lead to? Delusional. Okay, so you're delusional. If you're very confident about something and you don't have any good reason for it, it's delusional. Let's move to the other side of the spectrum where you're fearful or insecure about something. Now, if you're fearful or insecure and you don't really have any good reasons, let's say you are extremely good at your particular profession, but you still feel insecure about your skills and your competency, then that's kind of a sign of toxic self-doubt. Okay, so sometimes it's good to be confident, and if you're unable to feel confidence even though you have good reason to be, then that's a sign that you have some sort of mental issue and you have toxic self-doubt, unfortunately. But let's say you're fearful and insecure in a situation, but you have good reason to be. So you're out in the wild and a lion is running up towards you. To be fearful is it's an appropriate response. If a truck is approaching you in the street, you shouldn't stand there and be confident that it's not gonna, drive through you. You should be fearful in that moment, and that is an inappropriate response. So the point here is that you shouldn't always just be confident or just be fearful. Okay, that depends. And it also needs to be balanced with different types of things. Now, let's extend that to the power continuum. But I want to keep this in the case of governments, for example, the powerful government or state. So, on the one side, you have a state or government that's not very powerful. And the other side, you have a very highly powerful state, a lot of resources, strong military, a lot of money, a lot of influence, right? So let's work with the high power for a moment. So you've got a powerful state, but there's no accountability. There's no accountability from the people to the state. Okay, so the state isn't accountable to the people and they're not accountable to other states. What does that lead to? Tyranny, right? We have tyrannical governments just getting away with whatever they want to do. Now that's not good. But let's take another side of the spectrum. You have a weak state, the state that doesn't have much resources, it doesn't have a powerful military or a police system, doesn't have much influence. Now, if you have a weak and low power state and no accountability, what would that look like? It would be lawless, chaos. It would be, warlords reigning the streets. Okay, that's also not good. But if you have a low power state and you add to that, a lot of accountability, there's a lot of bureaucracy and stuff like that. What does that look like? Ineffectual. Nothing gets done. Everything is just, too encumbered by all these rules and accountability systems, but the state has no power to do anything. Okay, so let's turn back to this picture again. Now, what can we say at this stage? So we have all these different things that play a part, and they're all connected to each other and influence each other, and we should strive to create a balance between them. Okay, and there are a lot of different things to take into account. Like I've just mentioned, it's not just, should I be confident or not? It's should I be confident and humble and, open to new ideas, and, there's many different things that play a part in, decision making, or a virtue being a virtue, or a virtue becoming a vice. When does confidence, which can be seen as a virtue, when does that become a vice? Okay. It's when things aren't balanced with each other. It's when you don't take everything into account. It's when you don't understand all the variables that are at play. Okay, so this is to illustrate this idea of there are a lot of different things to take into account, and each has its influence, and we should try and balance them. Okay. Now, to just, summarize that, we have numerous and often opposing forces to consider. Okay, with any decision or action that you would make, I know you've probably experienced this, there's so many different variables to consider. And a lot of the times they're pulling you into different directions. Okay, they ask you to do different things. And another thing is it's impossible to consider all of the variables, right? There are an infinite amount of things to take into account in every decision that you make, and it's impossible to take everything into account, but we should still try and take as much into account as possible. Okay, if we just take complete shortcuts, we aren't responsive to the environment. Okay, but if we sit and just think and think and think, we become paralyzed. We're overwhelmed with information and data, and you can't make a decision. A decision is ultimately a leap of faith. It's a jump into the dark where you've tried to take as much into account as possible, but you're not a computer, so you can't calculate the thing. A decision is a decision because there's this leap. Okay, a leap into the dark. And the last thing is that an appropriate response depends on the circumstance. The appropriateness of an action isn't just an isolated thing. It depends on, what is the circumstance? Should you be kind or unkind in that moment? Should you be confident or not? Is tripping someone over that they fall appropriate or not? Well, if it's an old lady walking and you just walk up and trip them, obviously that's terrible to do. If you see a criminal running through the street with a handbag that he's just stolen, police chasing them, you trip that person, they fall, the police catch them, that seems to me to be an appropriate response. So, we have to take into consideration the circumstance, the context. Now, another thing that I found, so we've been speaking a lot about two things working together to create this wholeness, right? So we have one thing on the one side and another thing on the other. But what we also find is this rhythmic pendulum swing between the two, right? Where if you look at history, we went from a period of superstition to a very different type of thing where it's completely rationalism. So we went from superstition where everything can be explained in terms of the mood of the gods. It's raining today because Thor is upset, okay? Where every little occurrence you apply a type of meaning to it, where there isn't actually one. It's a superstitious world, okay? We believe in fairies and all these different things, but now the pendulum has swung to the different side where there's an overemphasis on, logic and rationalism, where if you can't measure it, if you can't prove it, doesn't exist. Okay, has no value, or it shouldn't be investigated. Now, you can't measure the impact of a kind gesture. Okay, you can't measure the value of having a loving relationship with people in your life. Okay, you can't measure that. Does that mean it doesn't have value? No. Okay, it's in a different realm. Okay, this is in the realm of meaning, and the other one is in the realm of science. And we have also the swing between repression and no limits. So if we take let's look at United States for a while. You know, they went in the early 1900s through the 50s, 60s, or 40s, 50s. There was quite a big period of, you know, repression, religious repression, sexual repression. It's extreme conservative type of values. And now the pendulum is swinging and overcorrecting to the other side, where there's this push where, you know, I don't even want to say it because I don't want to get demonetized for it, but people are pushing a bit too far of what is acceptable sexual behavior, particularly with people of young ages. And I don't know. So the point is just that we get this swing, right, from repression to no limits, from superstition to rationalism, from absolutism to relativism, where in absolutism is that this is the truth, this is what is right, God said so, or the government said so, and this is like an absolute fact, right? You can't question it, you can't deny it, this is what it is, okay? And now the swing is to relativism, where everything is your truth is your truth, my truth is my truth. There is no true morality. You can't really say what is right or wrong. It's all dependent on the person or the culture and stuff like that. Now, that also has its issue. And also this push from centralization to decentralization, from, you know, one entity controlling everything, like the king or the monarch having all the say and all the power, to a more decentralized approach where a democratic government has branches of the government to keep itself in check, to decentralize the power, to make it more distributed. And you can also see that in things like blockchain technology or DeFi, decentralized finance. So this leads into the last principle, also from that book, the Kabbalion, of the principle of rhythm, that states that everything flows out and in, everything has its tides, all things rise and fall, that the pendulum swing manifests in everything, that the measure of the swing to the right is the measure of the swing to the left. Rhythm compensates. Okay? Now, that part of the pendulum swing manifests in everything. Now, I've just listed a few examples, but you can try and think of your own, okay? If a lot of the times after a very dark period in your life, it goes out into a new dawn. Why is there that saying, it's always brightest before the dawn? Or if things are going horribly wrong, know that the shift is close. It's because there's this pendulum swing everywhere. And yeah, so that's very interesting. Now, for those of you that have watched this far, I want to leave you with a little gift of mine. So I've been using this symbol when I spoke about those 3 principles from that book. Now, this symbol is to illustrate what they would call the Philosopher's Stone. Okay, so I don't know if you've heard of the Philosopher's Stone. Now, the Philosopher's Stone is quite an old idea, and it usually had to do with alchemy. Okay, now what is alchemy? Traditionally, it has to do with the transmutation of base metals into gold, of an undesirable or unvaluable physical thing to something more valuable or very valuable. So to turn metal into gold, copper into gold. And it's also sometimes referred to as the elixir of life. It has to do with rejuvenation or immortality. And that in alchemical work, it has to do with the union of opposites, that somehow turning something undesirable into something desirable has to do with unifying opposites. Okay, now turning metal into gold is not something that I'm really interested in, and it's not something that is really valuable. Now, according to some people or teachings or whatever, that the real value of, you know, alchemy or the Philosopher's Stone isn't actually about turning metal into gold. The real value is symbolic. Okay, it was hidden in that physical thing, but the real value is symbolic. It's about transmutating or changing or transmuting pain and suffering into something better or valuable, or something that can contribute somehow. So there's this saying that if the branches of a tree wants to reach heaven, its roots need to go to hell. Okay, now an unfortunate fact of life is that much of it, not a small part, a lot of the times the majority or just a large part, has to do with pain, or suffering. And what are you to do with that pain or suffering? Okay, how can you transmute that into something good? Okay, now one way would be, let's say you've had a terrible experience as a child, right? Now, if you can somehow find a way to not do what was done to you, you had a terrible experience, and if you vow to yourself, you will make sure that you will not perpetuate that type of cycle, okay? That you will treat others or your children differently than how you were, that you will help people that went through the same thing as you, okay? Now, somehow, that pain and suffering that you experienced has become meaningful. It has become transmuted into some sort of gift to the world, okay? Now, would I have chosen a world of no pain and suffering? Probably, okay? So I'm not saying that, I'm saying that we need to accept the reality as it is, and unfortunately, pain and suffering is part of it, but how can we use it? How can we learn from it? Now, a lot of the times what pain or suffering or grief or losing a loved one does is it forces you inward. It forces you deeper into yourself of like, okay, why do I feel so bad? Why? It evokes so many different emotions in you. But if you can sit with that, if you can go deeper and somehow learn from it, somehow deepen your understanding of yourself, somehow develop deeper patience, deeper compassion, deeper empathy for yourself or other people, then that becomes transmuted into something more meaningful, okay? It's a lot of times, it's loss that teaches us the worth of something. Okay, it's a lot of the times it's only after you've lost something that you realize how valuable it actually was. Okay, so alchemy is about transmuting painful experiences or negative experiences into something valuable to you, into something that you can give to yourself or other people. Okay, so it breeds also empathy. If you know how difficult your life has been at times, if you know how hard it can be to deal with, everyday life of being a human, that, it deepens your compassion for other people, for empathy. If you had struggles with addiction, then you won't be so quick to judge someone else that struggles from the same thing, okay? So that's what the Philosopher's Stone is actually more about. It's about symbolic transmuting of something undesirable like pain and suffering into something valuable or desirable, like a gift you can give to someone else, or a deeper understanding of how your emotions work and how to heal yourself so you can feel better and then also heal other people in the process, and then make sure that in the future there's less suffering for people in general. And then lastly, it's also about integration of your shadow or lost parts. So the shadow has to do with Jungian psychology, and it's about the shadow is all those types of things that you wish you weren't. It's the things that you repress. It's the things you're ashamed about. It's the things that you don't want to be. Now, if you're able to sit with that part of you and not judge it and, shine the light of consciousness on it, then you can start to integrate some of the things that you can learn from your shadow. it's also, you know, your lost parts. So if someone is extremely introverted, their lost part would be extroversion. If someone is extremely masculine, their lost part would be their feminine side. Okay, so being masculine could be referred to as it's more of a penetrating type of thing, and then feminine is more of a receiving type of thing. If you're in the extremely rational state, you close yourself off to being intuitive, okay? Vice versa. So it's about integrating both aspects of yourself, of being a more integrated and whole individual in the long term. So yeah, that's the Philosopher's Stone. And then the final quote I want to leave you guys off with is that leaps in evolution usually occur in a manner of transcending and including, not by wiping out what came before. If we're truly going to evolve, we do so by including and integrating what came before into something greater, not by wiping it out. Okay, so what can we learn from something like superstition? What do we lose there? So superstition isn't something that you really want, but within the world of superstition, you also have myth and narrative and purpose and stuff like that. So that's what gets lost. You don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You need to understand what went wrong, but also extract, you know, some things to include. You know, in human history, there was periods of big tribalism. Okay, now tribalism isn't good, but if you reject it completely and refuse to understand where it comes from, you're doomed to repeat it eventually. You can't learn from it if you just, you know, wipe it out and reject it. You know, what is tribalism? What can we learn from it? It's that it's important to take care of those around you. It's that not everyone is out to help you. It's that you should protect what is yours, okay? But there's also bad things about tribalism, and that's what you should learn from to not do that into the future, okay? So human progress is like a spiral as well, okay? You need to understand what came before, integrate the good, okay? Understand what went wrong to build upon it. You can't reach the top and then cut everything off, because then you're going to fall down again, okay? So you should climb the ladder, understand the ladder, but then not kick out the ladder when you're at the top, because then eventually you're going to fall. So that's what this is about. And anyway, thanks for watching, and I hope that was useful. And if you watched the whole thing, thank you and congratulations. And yeah, I hope you have a very nice day, and yeah, bye.